They stripped her of her practicing license, tossed a cardboard box at her, and unceremoniously kicked her out the door. After 5 years of dedication in the emergency room, Nurse Elena Vance was fired in absolute humiliation simply because she had saved the life of a child against the protocol of an arrogant department chief. Desperate, penniless, and walking alone under the bone-chilling rain of Chicago, Elena thought that her life had truly reached a dead end. But she was wrong. A convoy of 5 glossy black Cadillacs surrounding her in the middle of the street did not stop by accident. They stopped because of her. Men dressed in black suits stepped down, and the man emerging from the center vehicle made the entire street hold its breath. It was Adrian Moretti, the architect of the Underworld, the most terrifying man in Chicago. Yet instead of guns or threats, what the head bodyguard screamed into the curtain of rain changed everything. He shouted that they did not need a doctor, they wanted the nurse. This is the story of a woman's journey from a destitute, unemployed outcast to becoming the sole person holding the life of a Mafia Don's son in her hands. It all began because she knew how to save a life that no renowned doctor dared to touch. Immediately after that frantic scream, Elena felt the blood inside her body seem to freeze as she stood rooted to the waterlogged sidewalk because the cold from the Chicago rain was nothing compared to the terror currently creeping into her every cell. In her mind, there remained only a single thought that they were about to eliminate her because she had accidentally witnessed some illicit transaction of the underworld, so Elena backed away by instinct. However, Silas, the head bodyguard with the physique of a giant, rushed forward like a predator. His rough hand tightened around her slender arm, not to handcuff or beat her, but to drag her aggressively toward the car with the open door. This forced Elena to struggle in vain as her heels slid on the slippery road surface and her mouth tried to scream for help, but the sound was choked in her throat. Right at that moment, the door of the Maybach in the very center of the convoy burst open and Adrian Moretti appeared like a powerful phantom amidst the gray rain with his expensive suit already soaked and his black hair plastered to his forehead. However, what made Elena stunned into silence was not the murderous aura radiating from him but his eyes. Those pitch-black eyes did not contain the killing intent or cruelty of the rumors but were overflowing with extreme panic and a primal fear of a human standing on the precipice of loss, which caused her to freeze for a moment. Before she could regain her composure, a powerful force shoved her into the plush back seat of the luxury car. Through the tinted glass, Elena watched the cardboard box containing the last shred of her dignity lying abandoned in the rain with the photographs and the small potted plant being washed away by the water, looking like a symbol of the normal life she once knew that had now officially ended. The convoy revved their engines and sped away like steel monsters tearing through the night, leaving behind the silence of the empty street while inside the hermetically sealed space of the car, the tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Adrian did not glance at her a single time as he leaned forward and roared at the driver with a voice hoarse from screaming every word as if freezing the entire space, commanding him to drive as fast as possible regardless of any traffic laws or red lights because if the boy died then all of them would be buried along with him this very night. Elena shrank back into the corner of the seat as the Maybach tore through the curtain of rain. Her trembling voice managed to choke out the question of what they wanted from her, but Adrian did not turn his head. Instead of an answer, he simply tossed a thick folder of medical records straight at her body. Under the sickly yellow streetlights sweeping through the rain-streaked car windows, Elena hurriedly flipped through each page. What struck her eyes was information regarding a 7-year-old pediatric patient in critical condition, suffering from a severe neck injury accompanied by a history of the rare vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Immediately, a current of cold electricity ran down her spine as her medical knowledge rushed back, signaling the deadly severity of this case. She understood all too well that the boy's blood vessels and tissues were currently as fragile as wet paper, liable to shatter at any moment under external force. She instantly grasped the matter of life and death at hand. She knew that if they attempted to insert a metal endotracheal tube following standard emergency procedures, the laryngoscope blade would tear through the child's esophagus and cause a tragic death right on the operating table in a mere split second. When Elena lifted her head with a look of bewilderment, Adrian finally spoke. His voice was hoarse, sounding like gravel grinding together, as he explained that the most skilled doctor in Chicago had cowardly refused to perform this procedure, fearing that the risk of failure would ruin his reputation. The powerful man's breath hitched as he confessed that they had ransacked the dilapidated archive system and found her name. She was the only person who had ever successfully saved a similar case in the past, making her their last hope. The car hurtled through the colossal iron gates of the Moretti estate and then braked sharply before the magnificent main hall. It forced Elena to realize that she was not merely going to save a person, but she was stepping into the lair of the architect of the underworld, a place where life and death were separated by only a fragile thread. Hurried footsteps carried her into the chaotic landscape of the mansion's medical room where the sharp scent of antiseptic failed to mask the heavy odor of despair. Immediately, Dr. Thorne, the family doctor standing there in helplessness, objected vehemently the moment he saw her appear. He screamed with dripping contempt, asking why the master had brought this unemployed girl here because she would surely kill Leo. Tuning out the insults, Elena fixed her gaze solely on the boy, Leo, lying on the bed with skin that had already turned a ghastly purple from the lack of air. His every labored and fragile breath made this image overlay painfully with the memory of Sophie, the former patient she had once failed to save. When Dr. Thorne attempted to rush forward to obstruct her, Adrian coldly drew his gun and aimed it directly at the old doctor's head. He did not pull the trigger but simply growled a threat to step aside or die. Amidst that suffocating pressure, Elena took a deep breath to brush away the fear that was besieging her. She walked briskly to the wash basin and clearly demanded a specific instrument, calling for a small soft silicone tube instead of the sharp metal variety typically used. Her steadfast gaze compelled everyone to obey, and in that instant, she seized full control of the room to commence the battle for life and death. The entire room sank into a silence so absolute that even the ticking of the clock became jarring as Elena began her work with such intense focus that it felt as though she were performing a sacred ritual rather than a mere medical procedure. Her hands moved with gentle precision, guiding the soft silicone tube millimeter by millimeter through the boy's swollen and fragile tissues while cold sweat began to bead on her forehead, yet her gaze never once wavered. Suddenly, the siren from the monitor screamed, tearing through the space as Leo's blood oxygen levels plummeted, making everyone's heart feel as if it had stopped beating while Dr. Thorne stood beside her and let out a malicious sneer as if he had been waiting for this very moment for a long time. Instead of panicking, Elena closed her eyes for exactly 1 second to shut out the surrounding noise and find her own calm rhythm, and when she opened her eyes, she softly adjusted the tip of the tube, tilting it at a microscopic angle of 2 degrees to the left. That moment stretched out like an eternity until the sound of the monitor shifted from the frantic warning to a steady, rhythmic beep and Leo's small chest began to rise and fall rhythmically as it welcomed the flow of life-giving oxygen. Witnessing that his son had escaped the scythe of death, Adrian looked as if he had been drained of all strength as he collapsed into a nearby armchair and buried his face in his hands to hide his trembling, for the first time revealing the naked vulnerability of a father rather than the cold cruelty of an underworld boss. Several hours later, when Leo's breathing had finally stabilized and the critical danger had passed, Adrian invited Elena into his private study where the sickly yellow light cast upon the ancient oak bookshelves created an atmosphere of pressure that weighed heavily on her shoulders. Elena stood with her back straight even though her legs felt leaden with exhaustion, and she raised her voice to demand that she be allowed to return home immediately to escape this living hell. However, the response she received was a cold silence before Adrian announced in a voice devoid of any emotion that she no longer had a home to return to because her landlord had thrown her out onto the street that very morning. That brutal truth struck her like a splash of ice water right in the face and left Elena stunned into silence. Before she could even react, Adrian slid a phone toward her across the surface of the glossy wooden desk, displaying a banked message that her account had just received the colossal sum of $500,000 along with a notification that the entire massive debt her good-for-nothing ex-husband had left behind had been paid off plainly to the very last cent. Elena glared at that number with a mixture of bewilderment and extreme fury as she realized her private life had been unburied without mercy by the man sitting opposite her. Yet Adrian did not let her have the chance to explode, but instead delivered a cold proposition that she stay here to work as the private nurse for Leo with a salary of $300,000 per year. Standing at the crossroads of her life, Elena hesitated and bit her lip until it bled, but when she thought of the fragile gaze of the child she had just saved and the destitute reality of her own existence, she nodded her head in agreement to sell her soul to the devil in exchange for safety for Leo and for herself. The next morning, the weak sunlight creeping through the heavy layers of thick velvet curtains awakened Elena within a vast room of the utmost luxury that she had never dared to dream of in her entire life, yet it exuded a strange and bone-chilling coldness. She hurriedly prepared herself and then walked quickly to the medical room where young Leo lay. Her heart felt as if it were being squeezed tight when she saw the boy's large, round, and innocent eyes open to stare at her with full curiosity before he raised a weak voice to ask if she was an angel. That naive question left Elena stunned, but before she could answer, she felt a sharp gaze from the doorway where Adrian stood quietly observing every gesture of the two of them with an unreadable expression. Elena took a deep breath to regain her composure, turned to look straight into the eyes of the mob boss, and clearly established her working boundaries immediately by stating that she was staying here solely to care for Leo. She emphasized every word with determination that she would see nothing, hear nothing, and absolutely not speak a single word about his dark business to anyone. Adrian did not reply but only gave a slight smirk to accept that silent compromise. Yet the moment he turned his back to walk away, Elena truly felt the loneliness and coldness enveloping this vast house like a magnificent tomb imprisoning lost souls. 1 week passed agonizingly slowly within the Moretti mansion, causing Elena to gradually realize the heartbreaking truth that Leo was not merely a fragile patient. He was a child lonely to the extreme, kept under house arrest within his own home without friends or permission to step a single foot into the outside world. The specter of Dr. Thorne still loomed everywhere like a vulture stalking a corpse as he constantly sought every method to scrutinize her tiniest gestures to report back to Adrian in order to sow doubt regarding her competence in the mind of the boss. However, Elena paid no mind to those despicable games but instead channeled her entire focus into completely overhauling the daily routine and nutrition for Leo, starting with the meals. A heated altercation erupted in a cavernous kitchen when she adamantly demanded that the head chef discard the elaborate yet tepid 5-star restaurant dishes to replace them with steaming hot chicken soup cooked in a simple family style that contained the warmth of affection. Her obstinacy was rewarded when for the first time Leo agreed to finish the entire bowl of soup. The boys' pealing laughter echoed throughout the gloomy corridors, which were inherently filled with only a deathly silence, and it dispelled some of the coldness pervading this place. That night the stillness of the mansion was shattered by Leo's frantic scream as a nightmare struck, causing the boy to cower in sheer terror. Elena rushed to the bedside to gather his trembling small body into her arms and gently soothed him to drive away the phantoms in the child's mind. In his sobbing fit, Leo lifted his tear-filled eyes to ask about his mother, causing Elena's heart to constrict because although she knew his mother had passed away, the cause of death remained a painful mystery that no one dared to mention. Unsure of how to answer, she could only raise her voice in a soothing lullaby to coax the boy back to sleep, and that sweet melody drifted out into the hallway where Adrian, having just returned, stood silently like a statue submerged in the darkness. He leaned his back against the wall and squeezed his eyes shut, allowing the memories of his late wife to rush back with every verse, but strangely this time the pain no longer tore at his soul like a knife but had become much gentler. That very moment marked a silent change within the ruthless boss as he began to return home earlier every evening to seek a little family warmth, and the acrid smell of gunpowder along with the strong reek of alcohol that had haunted him for so many years also gradually faded from his person. Late that night, the Chicago sky roared with the fury of Mother Nature as bolts of lightning tore through the darkness and the rolling thunder caused even the fortified mansion to tremble slightly. Elena jolted awake with a parched throat, so she hastily threw on a thin robe and tiptoed down the spiral staircase to find some cool water to soothe her thirst, but as she passed the vast living room submerged in thick darkness, she suddenly froze because the distinct, metallic scent of fresh blood assaulted her senses. A flash of lightning through the floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated a horrifying scene in a split second that made her heart constrict as she saw Adrian slumped over in a dark leather armchair with one shoulder of his pristine white shirt now soaked in a spreading, mottled patch of crimson. His breathing was heavy and ragged, revealing that he had just dragged his battered body back from a brutal, bloody purge of the underworld where human life was cheaper than dirt, and as soon as the keen senses of a killer detected the sound of her footsteps, Adrian immediately lifted his head with bloodshot eyes and growled a dismissal in a voice hoarse with pain, commanding her to go back to her room immediately and not to look at him. The coldness and authority in that voice were usually enough to make any burly man tremble in obedience, but at this moment, to Elena, it was merely the desperate cry for help of a wounded animal trying to conceal its weakness. Instead of fleeing in fear as her instincts dictated, she spun around and walked briskly toward the medicine cabinet to retrieve the specialized medical kit. She returned to stand towering before the Mafia boss, the man known as the architect of fear, and when she saw him attempt to struggle to his feet to push her away, Elena glared and shouted right in his face with a steely voice that echoed amidst the thunder, warning him to sit still or she would let him bleed to death right there in that chair. That haughty command fell into the silent space like a sledgehammer, leaving Adrian stunned to the point of forgetting his pain because this was the first time in his life, a life full of violence and absolute submission from others, that someone had the audacity to give him an order, and strangely, his body unconsciously relaxed to allow that petite woman to take control. The atmosphere in the living room was draped in absolute stillness, broken only by the rhythmic patter of rain outside and their mingling breaths as Elena focused with intense concentration on stitching Adrian's wound. Under the dim, ambient light of a night lamp, Adrian suddenly noticed the faint, crisscross scars upon her slender wrists, the painful remnants of the years she suffered abuse at the hands of her ex-husband, and he broke the silence with a question that caused Elena to freeze in her tracks. Dark memories came flooding back, choking her with emotion as she recounted the story of her life, speaking of the child she had lost and the physical and spiritual anguish she had been forced to endure, which caused her to sob in silent, convulsive heaves. Adrian did not offer hollow words of comfort but instead reached out to firmly grasp her trembling hand in a gesture filled with possession and protection, then growled a definitive declaration that no one would ever be able to harm her again. That singular moment between two deeply damaged souls forged a profound and sacred connection that blurred the lines between the crime lord and the nurse. 1 week after that fateful stormy night, the atmosphere within the Moretti mansion had transformed completely as Elena bustled about preparing for Leo's very first birthday party after so many years of confinement in solitude. Although the cream cake she had baked with her own hands was slightly lopsided and the frosting was clumsily imperfect compared to the confections from famous bakeries, Leo's eyes lit up with a supreme happiness as the boy blew out the candles beside his father and his angel nurse. The small party consisted of merely 3 people along with a few trusted bodyguards keeping watch from a distance, yet it was strangely cozy when Adrian unexpectedly presented his son with a golden retriever boasting a coat of shimmering gold named Max, causing Leo to squeal with pure joy. Elena also smiled as she handed the boy a sea blue wool scarf that she had diligently knitted stitch by stitch during the late hours of the night, and Leo immediately wrapped it around his neck, refusing to take it off. When night fell and Leo was fast asleep beside his new dog, Adrian and Elena stood silently together on the windswept balcony gazing down at the city of Chicago shimmering with lights below. For the first time in his life, the mob boss let out a soft sigh and confessed to her in a deep, melancholic voice that he had been mistaken to think that money and power could ever compensate for the absence of a mother's love for his son. The lingering peace of the birthday celebration was quickly torn asunder when a terrifying calamity struck in the dead of the silent night. The mansion's state-of-the-art security system was suddenly and completely rendered useless, transforming the darkness into an accomplice for the invading enemy. Immediately, the deafening roar of gunfire shattered the stillness like the hammers of death pounding against the eardrums. Elena, who had been submerged in an exhausted slumber, bolted upright in a state of sheer panic as the furious, frantic scream of Silas erupted from the intercom, signaling that their impenetrable line of defense had been breached. In that precipitous moment hanging by a thread, her survival instinct urged her to hide, yet her heart pulled her in a different direction. She burst out of her room and ran for her life down the long, cavernous corridor toward Leo's quarters, ignoring the deadly danger stalking her from every shadow. When she pushed open the door, the sight of the empty bed caused the blood in her veins to freeze. However, a faint whimper guided her gaze beneath the bed where Leo was cowering and trembling in absolute terror beside Max, the dog who was baring his teeth and growling to protect his tiny master from the intruders. Elena hurriedly dragged Leo from beneath the bed and hoisted the boy into her arms, disregarding his dead weight and the violent trembling of the child, to rush out into the corridor, which was now thick with smoke and the acrid stench of gunpowder. Her footsteps faltered on the erratic line between life and death, but just as she turned the corner, a massive masked shadow loomed up to block the path with a cold, black gun muzzle pointed straight at the two of them. In that moment of facing the Reaper, without a single shred of hesitation, Elena spun around to use her slender back as a human shield to completely cover Leo, squeezing her eyes shut as she awaited the bullet that would end her life. However, the deafening bang that rang out did not pierce her flesh, but was followed by the sound of the assassin's heavy body collapsing onto the floor. Immediately after, Silas stepped out from the smoke with a face full of murderous fury and a gun in his hand that was still smoking. The head bodyguard shouted, signaling her to run immediately toward the secret passage leading down to the panic room, a safe haven designed to withstand even bombs, while he stayed behind to cover their rear. Amidst her desperate flight with ragged breath and fear closing in, through the flickering firelight reflected on the corridor glass, Elena was stunned to catch a glimpse of a familiar silhouette sneaking open the back gate to escape. That cowering posture and the familiar doctor's attire made her realize instantly that the traitor was none other than Dr. Thorne. The heavy, thick steel door of the safe room slammed shut with a dry, metallic clang, separating the three of them from the chaotic world outside and submerging the space in cold white LED light. It was only then that Leo broke down into sobbing tears as the boy clung tightly to Elena's neck and asked through his choking gasps if his father was already dead, causing her heart to constrict in pain. That question, innocent yet cruel, felt like salt being rubbed into a wound, threatening to detonate the fear also lurking within her to the point of explosion. However, Elena knew she was not permitted to be weak at this moment, so she swallowed her tears back inside to become the most solid spiritual pillar for the child. She clasped his small, trembling body to her chest, whispering false assurances while her ears strained to listen to the situation outside where the deafening gunfire had ceased, yielding its place to a deathly silence that was 1,000 times more terrifying. Time seemed to stop drifting until the sound of the electronic door latch rang out, signaling that someone was unlocking it, which made Elena hold her breath and shield Leo as she backed away. Yet when the door burst open, the person who entered was not the Reaper but Adrian, appearing in a horrifying state with his entire body dyed in the fresh crimson blood of his enemies. Before she could even regain her composure, Adrian rushed forward like a whirlwind and embraced both of them into his solid chest, disregarding the blood smearing onto them, and in that embrace, tightened to the point of suffocation, the sacred moment of a true family was established amidst the ashes of violence. A somber dawn light washed over the devastated landscape of the Moretti estate the following morning, where shards of broken glass and the jagged scars of bullet holes still lay scattered everywhere, heralding a grim emergency meeting convened to unearth the traitor within. In an atmosphere so thick with tension it felt suffocating, the sharp and suspicious gazes of the bodyguards immediately converged upon Elena, for she was the solitary outsider who had just stepped into the family fold and was the single variable that aligned perfectly with the moment the violence had struck. Yet Adrian would not allow a single soul to utter a word of insulting accusation against the woman who had saved the life of his son, and he brushed aside every shadow of doubt with a decisive sweep of his hand while his eyes burned with the declaration that he placed his absolute and unconditional trust in her. Bolstered by the strength of that unwavering protection, Elena drew a deep and steadying breath to compose herself before raising her voice clearly to shatter the silence, revealing that she had witnessed Dr. Thorne lurking furtively by the rear gate the previous night. Without a moment of hesitation, Silas plunged into a review of the security camera footage and telephone records, and a roar of fury tore from his throat as the undeniable proof materialized to confirm that the wretched family physician had indeed sold them out, driven by a sickly jealousy of Elena and a bottomless greed for the enemy's gold. Dr. Thorne was dragged unceremoniously down into the damp basement where the musty odor of mold mingled with the metallic tang of blood left by former traitors to create a terrifying and suffocating atmosphere, and he groveled at the feet of Adrian, trembling like a sewer rat driven into a dead end as he repeatedly bowed his head to the floor and begged for his life with the most abject and cowardly of words. Adrian stood there like a brutal judge with a cold pistol in his hand, poised to dispense death as punishment for the man who had dared to threaten the life of his son. But just as his finger was about to tighten against the trigger, the heavy basement door swung open and Elena stepped inside with a face full of determined courage. That single action left every bodyguard stunned, for never before had anyone dared to intervene during the boss's moment of judgment. Yet Elena did not flinch as she walked straight over to stand before the muzzle of the gun and placed her hand upon Adrian's rigid arm while gently shaking her head to say that he must not kill him for the sake of Leo, for his blood would stain the soul of the child and haunt his future, so instead he should let him endure a life that was worse than death. Adrian slowly lowered the weapon as he grasped her profound intent, and the final decision that was reached proved to be far more cruel than death itself when Dr. Thorne was handed over to the police along with the entirety of the evidence regarding the falsified medical records and the conspiracy to commit murder that Silas had so thoroughly collected. The fate of the once prestigious physician was sealed, as he would be stripped of his medical license forever and forced to spend the remainder of his life rotting within a dark prison where belated remorse would gnaw at his conscience every single day. However, Adrian's retribution did not merely cease with the traitor within the house, for his arm of power extended far beyond those walls to settle all debts for his woman in the most absolute terms, as he silently mobilized his underground connections to thoroughly attend to Dr. Sterling, the imperious department head who had once fired Elena in disgrace. Only a few days later, earth-shattering news erupted across every headline when the prestigious St. Jude Hospital was exposed for a series of horrific corruption scandals, and the image of Dr. Sterling being led away in handcuffs with his head hung low appeared pervasively on television, ensuring that justice was finally served. Amidst the eye of the public storm, a representative of the hospital board called Elena directly with a groveling tone to apologize for the unjust termination of the past, while simultaneously rolling out the red carpet to invite her back to assume the position of head nurse with a lavish salary that anyone in the profession would covet. Elena held the phone in her hand, listening to the sweet promises of prestige, yet her gaze did not rest upon the screen but instead drifted straight out to the sun-drenched garden through the window frame, where young Leo was laughing and running joyfully with Max the dog, and beside them was Adrian, the most powerful man in the city, who was shedding his cold exterior to play with his son, creating a tableau of domestic happiness that she had never imagined she would ever possess. Elena tightened her grip on the phone in her hand and drew a breath so deep it seemed to gather every ounce of her courage before she spoke the definitive words of refusal to the life-changing opportunity she had once burned to possess. She gently ended the call, as if severing the final tether to a painful past so that she could commit herself heart and soul to the present, but in that very moment the sound of familiar footsteps echoed behind her, compelling her to turn and meet the dark and brooding gaze of Adrian, who had been leaning against the doorframe for some time and had heard the conversation in its entirety. With a face filled with questioning mixed with the gnawing torment of a man who did not wish to stifle her future, he walked slowly toward her and asked in a voice that was low and husky why she would not go, for was that not the lifelong dream she had always chased? Elena looked at the powerful man standing before her with eyes that were gentle yet unwavering, and she smiled as she shook her head and stepped closer to him to whisper an answer that came from the very bottom of her heart, revealing that her true dream was to save lives and to possess a happy home, and right here beside him and Leo she had found both of those things. That sentence acted as the key that threw wide open the gates of the Mafia boss's heart, which had been sealed shut for so long, causing every ounce of his restraint to shatter, and Adrian spoke no further words but instead surged forward to wrap his arms tightly around her waist, pulling her forcefully against him to press upon her lips their first kiss, which was burning and fierce and contained all the love he had kept buried for so long. 1 year passed as quickly as the blink of an eye, and the once gloomy garden had now been replaced by pristine white silk ribbons and thousands of flowers showing off their colors on the most momentous day of Elena's life. Little Leo was now completely healthy, with rosy cheeks and a radiant smile as he carefully held the velvet pillow containing the pair of wedding rings and walked with a steady maturity toward his parents. The Chicago sky began to drizzle again, just like on that fateful night when Elena had been fired, but this time the raindrops no longer carried the bone-chilling cold of despair but instead watered the soul with the sweet taste of perfect happiness. Elena had now officially become Mrs. Moretti, and she stood there in a wedding dress that was simple yet exquisite as she gently cast her eyes back over the extraordinary journey from a nurse who had lost everything to the moment she found it all in the most unexpected of places. The story concluded with a dreamlike image as the family of 3 along with Max the dog joined hands to dance beneath the curtain of rain, ignoring the water soaking their expensive formal wear, for their happy laughter echoed far beyond every pain of the past. Through this emotional story we realize that even in the darkest moments of life the light of hope and love always exists, provided that we hold fast to our conscience and kindness, for then destiny will smile and happiness will blossom and bear fruit from the wounds that have healed. If you feel moved by this humanistic story of love and family affection, then please do not hesitate to press the subscribe button for the channel, as well as like and share this video to spread these good things and to watch many more fascinating stories that we update every day. What are your thoughts on the journey of Elena and Adrian, or do you see a shadow of yourself in their efforts to overcome adversity? So please leave a comment sharing the feelings from deep within your heart so that we may discuss them together. Finally, we wish all the audience members watching this video abundant health and a joyful spiritual life where every passing day is peaceful and happy. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the following videos.